The classroom went dead silent the moment the cash spilled out of his bag. Every eye turned to the pile of red banknotes on the floor, and every eye turned to him. His accuser held the money above her head like a trophy, and around him, 30 classmates decided, without proof, that he was a thief. What none of them knew, not even the woman standing at the front of the room glaring at him with disgust, was that the boy they were about to destroy had woken up that same morning worth more money than everyone in that building combined, teachers included. He said nothing. He let them believe what they wanted, because the truth was so much stranger than anything they could imagine, and he wasn't ready to say it out loud. To understand how he ended up here, it helps to go back 3 days. His name was Xiao Yang, and for as long as anyone at his school could remember, he had been the poor one, worn shoes, secondhand jacket, the kind of quiet that people mistake for weakness. He lived with his homeroom teacher, a woman named Li Annie, in an arrangement that confused everyone who heard about it. Years earlier, his parents had done the Li family a great favor, and to repay that debt, the two families had arranged a marriage between their children while they were still practically kids. Xiao Yang's parents vanished not long after, leaving him in Li Annie's care, and leaving her stuck with a husband she never chose and clearly wished she hadn't. She fed him, she paid for his living expenses, she also seemed to resent every part of it. In the eyes of nearly everyone around them, Xiao Yang was a burden she carried out of duty, not love. He had gotten used to the size, the sharp comments, the way she compared him unfavorably to anyone with a decent job or a nice car. What he hadn't gotten used to, not really, was the ache underneath it. He wanted her respect. He wanted, somewhere deep down he barely admitted to himself, her love, and he had no idea how to earn either one, while wearing the same jacket for 2 winters straight. Then, his phone buzzed with a message from a number he hadn't seen in years, his mother. The woman who had disappeared from his life without explanation was suddenly asking to send him money, calling it compensation for lost time. He opened his banking app, half expecting a joke, maybe a few hundred yuan out of guilt. He counted the zeros twice, then a third time, because his brain refused to accept it. 1 billion yuan had landed in his account, transferred by a mother he barely remembered, for reasons she didn't bother to explain. He sat there in stunned silence, the number glowing on his screen, his whole understanding of his life rearranging itself in seconds. He never got the chance to process it. Before the shock even settled, a girl named Shu Lingling stormed across the classroom and announced, loudly enough for everyone to hear, that the class funds were missing and that he had taken them. Shu Lingling was the kind of classmate who enjoyed being looked up to. Class monitor, sharp-tongued, dating a boy named Zhang Yang, who backed up whatever she said without asking questions. The two of them had never liked Xiao Yang much. Poor kids didn't fit into their world, and his marriage to a teacher only made him stranger in their eyes, not more respectable. He denied it immediately, and something in him finally cracked loose. He told her that being poor didn't make him a thief, that she could mock him for his empty pockets, but she had no right to touch his character. It was the angriest anyone in that room had ever seen him, and for a second, a few classmates actually seemed to believe him. Murmurs started. Someone suggested Shu Lingling check her own things again before blaming him. Then Zhang Yang walked in with a smile that told everyone he had something to say. He claimed he'd spotted Xiao Yang that afternoon, walking into an expensive restaurant near the school, the kind of place a scholarship kid had no business entering. It wasn't proof of anything, but it didn't need to be. In a room already primed to believe the worst, a rumor was as good as a confession. Classmates who had defended him moments earlier started asking why he wouldn't just admit it and give the money back. He held his ground. He told them exactly where the accusation could go. But holding his ground only made Shu Lingling angrier, and she demanded the right to search him, right there in front of everyone, to prove her point. He let her. He had nothing to hide, or so he thought. She found nothing in his pockets. For a moment, something like relief crossed his face. Then she grabbed his backpack instead and dumped it onto the classroom floor without asking. That's when the cash fell out. His own money. the small stack he'd withdrawn from the bank the night before, and stuffed carelessly into a textbook because he didn't own a wallet worth using. He'd forgotten it was even there. Now it lay scattered across the floor like a confession he never made, and Xu Lingling snatched it up before he could explain, holding it high so nobody in the room could miss it. This was the moment the story opened on. The silence, the stares, the instant judgment written across every face in that classroom, including, worst of all, the face of his own teacher. Li Annie had walked in only moments before, and the sight of that much cash falling out of a boy who barely had bus fare stopped her cold. She knew exactly how much money she gave him each month. She knew he'd been spending heavily on taxis and food the past few days already. There was no version of this that made sense to her, and rather than ask him quietly, rather than pull him aside the way a wife or even a decent teacher might, she let her anger take over in front of the entire class. He tried to explain. He told her she of all people should know his character, know he wasn't capable of something like this. She wasn't interested in explanations anymore. She slammed her hand down and told him to get out, that she didn't want a student like him. He stood outside that classroom for the rest of the lesson, cold air seeping through a jacket too thin for the season, replaying her words. Not the accusation from Xu Lingling. Hers. Years of living under her roof. Years of trying to be someone she wouldn't be embarrassed by. And this was the verdict she reached the second things looked bad. When the bell rang, Xu Lingling made sure to walk past him slowly, savoring it, telling him that some people just didn't know how to be grateful for the chances they were given. He told her she could laugh at him all she wanted, but she had no right to question his integrity. She laughed anyway and walked off like she'd won something. Li Annie called him into her office next, and the conversation there was worse. She wanted to know if he understood what stealing meant. He told her he found the money, which, technically, was true enough, though he couldn't say where or how without sounding insane. She didn't believe a word of it. She told him she was disgusted by the idea of being tied to someone like him for life, and something in her voice made it clear she meant it. He walked out of that office, angrier than he'd been in years. Not at her exactly. At the years of being underestimated, at a life where the truth sounded less believable than the lie. He had 1 billion yuan sitting in his account, and nobody in that building would believe he could afford a decent meal. So he made a decision, standing in that hallway. If nobody in his life was willing to trust him without proof, he would stop trying to convince them with words. He hailed a taxi and told the driver to take him to the most expensive residential development in the city. He was done being told what he could and couldn't afford. When he walked into the sales office, dressed the same as always, the staff barely looked up. A senior salesperson took one glance at his worn clothes and waved an intern over to get rid of him politely, telling her not to let him break anything on the tour. Nobody there had the faintest idea who they were dismissing, and that gap between what they assumed and what was actually true was about to become very expensive for at least one of them. He didn't correct anyone yet. He simply asked how much the units cost and let the salesperson's contempt answer for itself. Somewhere across that showroom floor, a familiar face was about to walk in, a rich young man Xiao Yang had crossed paths with once before. Someone who was about to learn exactly how wrong first impressions could be. The doors opened again, and this time, every salesperson in the room stood up at once. A young man walked in with slicked-back hair and the kind of confidence money buys early in life. Xiao Yang recognized him instantly. Zhou Chang, the same young master who had once tried to steal his private dining room at a restaurant days earlier, acting like the world owed him a seat wherever he wanted one. The senior salesperson practically ran to greet him, calling him young Master Zhou, promising him the finest unit in the building, full furnishings, luxury finishes, everything worthy of his status. Zhou Chang waved a hand and told them to show him the best one they had. His voice carried across the room on purpose, loud enough for everyone to hear exactly who he was. Xiao Yang spoke up from where he stood and asked if he could come along and see it too. The salesperson barely glanced his way before telling him to think about whether he could even afford to look. Xiao Yang pointed out that he'd arrived first. The man laughed in his face, and told him there was no comparing an ordinary visitor to someone like young Master Zhou. That was when Zhou Chang actually looked at him and froze. Recognition flickered across his face, and for a second, he seemed unsure how to play it. Then his old arrogance won out. He decided showing Xiao Yang the property might be entertaining, a chance to watch a poor kid stare wide-eyed at something he'd never own. He told the salesperson to let him tag along, that it would be good for him to see what he was missing out on. They walked through a unit that was, admittedly, beautiful. Wide windows, imported furniture, marble floors that caught the light. Zhou Chang's eyes lit up as he pictured himself living there, until the salesperson quoted the price. 7.5 million yuan, discounted to 7.2. Something shifted behind Zhou Chang's eyes. His allowance was generous by most standards, but nowhere near that number, and he'd already burned through a chunk of it on a new sports car. He couldn't admit that in front of a room full of people, so instead he started inventing complaints. The location was too central. There wasn't enough parking. The lighting was wrong. He picked apart a mansion he desperately wanted, because admitting the real problem would have cost him more than the house itself. The salesperson, sensing exactly what was happening, offered a garage to sweeten the deal, pushing the total past 8 million. Zhou Chang's composure cracked further. He complained about the sofa. He complained about the marble floor being too hard to fall on safely, as if that were a real concern for a 20-something man buying his first home. Nobody in the room believed him anymore. The senior salesperson, sharp enough to read the situation, quietly suggested other properties in the 1 to 2 million range instead, ones that might, he said carefully, better fit certain budgets. Zhou Chang exploded, demanding to know if he was being insulted. He reminded everyone loudly that he was Zhou Chang, that money meant nothing to him. Nobody in the room believed that either, not anymore. Xiao Yang had finished his walkthrough by then. He turned to the intern who'd been quietly showing him around despite her boss's orders and asked if salespeople earned commission on sales. She nodded, confused by the question. He told her simply that he'd take the unit and the garage as well, then pulled out his card and handed it over. The senior salesperson's face went blank. Zhou Chang had spent the last 10 minutes calling this same boy a poor loser who couldn't afford the toilet in the bathroom, and now he was watching him casually agree to buy the most expensive unit in the building. Zhou Chang laughed it off, telling everyone that if this kid actually managed to pay for it, he'd admit he was wrong. He didn't get the chance to eat those words gracefully. Xiao Yang returned minutes later with a signed contract in hand, and Zhou Chang's face drained of color as he read the paperwork over his shoulder. More than 7 million yuan, paid without hesitation by someone he'd spent the entire visit humiliating. Zhou Chang muttered that it was impossible, that even his own father would struggle to pull together that much cash on short notice. Then he turned and left without another word, his pride bruised worse than any slap could manage. The senior salesperson stood frozen, doing the math on the commission he'd nearly lost by judging a customer on his jacket. It wasn't a lesson he'd forget quickly. Xiao Yang sat alone in his new home that evening, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with his body. For the first time all day, nobody was watching him, judging him, or waiting for him to fail. It didn't last long. His phone rang with news of his uncle's birthday dinner that night, and he grabbed a taxi back into the world that still had no idea who he'd become. Liani was already waiting outside the restaurant when he arrived, and her expression soured the moment she saw him step out of a cab instead of walking, as if even that small extravagance offended her. She told him flatly that she wasn't going to help cover up a theft, that no matter what he claimed, people like him never amounted to much. He answered calmly that she might be wrong about that. It only made her angrier. Her aunt appeared next, dismissing him with a glance, before dragging Liani inside, muttering that talking to someone like him was a waste of breath. Inside, the restaurant's manager greeted him with unusual warmth, a small detail that puzzled everyone around him, but that he chose not to explain. At the table, his aunt wasted no time needling him about the gift he'd brought, implying he couldn't possibly have paid for it honestly. His uncle tried weakly to defend him, earning only more scorn from her. Xiao Yang had learned to sit through this kind of thing in silence, the way someone learns to sit through cold weather without a proper coat. Then a young man walked in, polished and confident, apologizing on his mother's behalf for missing the celebration. The aunt's entire demeanor transformed. This was Chung Yu, heir to a wealthy family, and within seconds she was steering him toward Liani, gushing about her niece's ambitions and how perfectly the two of them might fit together. She made sure to mention, loudly enough for Xiao Yang to hear, that Chung Yu was far more impressive than certain other people at the table. When Chung Yu finally noticed Xiao Yang sitting quietly nearby, the aunt cut in before he could ask anything, calling him nothing more than a poor relative who'd tagged along. She never mentioned that he was actually Liani's husband. Watching a stranger casually offer to buy his uncle new suits, watching Liani exchange contact information with him under his own aunt's encouragement, Xiao Yang felt something twist in his chest that had nothing to do with logic. He knew nothing improper had happened. He felt the jealousy anyway. Chung Yu eventually turned to him and asked, almost as an afterthought, where he worked. Before he could answer, the aunt jumped in again, calling him a poor student with no ambition to speak of. Chung Yu offered him a job out of what looked like generosity, but felt more like a performance, a chance to look magnanimous in front of the woman he was courting. His aunt scolded Xiao Yang for even hesitating to accept, calling the opportunity rare and precious. That was when Liani finally spoke, and for one fragile second, Xiao Yang thought she might be standing up for him. She only asked her aunt to stop, saying it was ruining the mood of the celebration. Then she turned to him with open disgust and told him that if he wanted a better life, he should earn it honestly instead of relying on tricks. Whatever small hope had sparked in him disappeared as quickly as it came. The final blow of the evening arrived when the restaurant's female manager approached and handed him a thick stack of cash, claiming it was payment owed to him from an earlier favor, along with a subtle wink that told him she was only trying to help him save face. His aunt misread the entire gesture, announcing loudly that the poor waiter had been reduced to accepting handouts now on top of everything else. Chung Yu added his own mockery, offering to let him eat on his tab whenever his shifts got tiring. Xiao Yang looked at the cash on the table, at Chung Yu's satisfied smile, at his aunt's contempt, and finally at Liani, who had turned her face away rather than meet his eyes. He left the money untouched and walked out without a word of explanation. The manager chased after him to apologize, but he stopped her. She'd only been trying to protect him. None of this was her fault. He went home and slept without dinner, and the next morning brought exactly the kind of start he expected. He was late again, and Liani was already fuming at the front of the classroom when he arrived. He stepped back outside before she could even begin, choosing to take the punishment quietly rather than provoke a bigger scene. Even through the closed door, he heard her slam her lesson plan down hard enough to make him flinch from the hallway. Back at his desk after class, Shu Lingling wasted no time reminding him of his place, mocking him for having the nerve to show his face at all after what she still believed he'd done. Zhang Yang piled on, accusing him of spending stolen money on fine dining without a hint of shame. Xiao Yang finally snapped and told them both to stop talking nonsense. Then the door opened, and Liani walked back in, with a different look on her face than the one she'd worn all week. She asked Shu Lingling, directly and firmly, whether she was truly certain Xiao Yang had taken the money. Something in her tone had changed overnight, and the classroom went quiet, sensing that whatever came next was about to tip the whole situation on its head. Shu Lingling didn't hesitate. She told the teacher she was certain that it had to be Xiao Yang, no doubts at all. Zhang Yong backed her up immediately, asking how anyone was supposed to focus on studying with a thief still sitting in the room. Liani's expression hardened in a way none of them had seen before. She asked Shu Lingling again, slower this time, whether she was absolutely sure she hadn't simply misplaced the money herself and forgotten about it. Shu Lingling blinked, confused by the question, and repeated that it had to be him. That was when Liani slammed her hand down on the podium, hard enough to silence the room completely. She reminded everyone she'd told them not to jump to conclusions before anything was properly investigated. Then she pulled an envelope from her bag and set it down in front of Xu Lingling, telling her to take a good look, because she'd found it in the school office herself. The color drained from Xu Lingling's face the instant she recognized it. She stammered that it wasn't her fault, that maybe Xiao Yang had worked with the restaurant owner to frame her somehow, an excuse so desperate it made the whole class go quiet with secondhand embarrassment. Li Ani wasn't interested in more excuses. She told Xu Lingling that not only had she failed to take responsibility, she'd tried to drag an innocent classmate down with her. She stripped her of her position as class monitor on the spot and walked out on her heels without looking back. Xiao Yang sat there feeling something close to relief, and he let a small smile slip before he could stop himself. Li Ani caught it from the doorway and turned back, just long enough to remind him that he still bore some responsibility in all this too, that he had no right to look pleased with himself. He swallowed the smile immediately. He'd learned enough about her moods to know better than to celebrate early. Xu Lingling sat back down with her fists clenched, eyes red, staring at him with a hatred that hadn't existed an hour earlier. Whatever grudge she'd carried before, it had just become personal. After school, Li Ani told him she had somewhere to be that evening and left him to sort out dinner on his own. He hailed a cab home, and the ride gave him time to think about something the taxi driver said as they pulled up outside his new building. The man looked at the address, then at Xiao Yang, and asked why someone who could afford a place like this didn't already own a car. It was a fair question. Xiao Yang had money and a license, and no real reason to keep taking taxis everywhere. He walked into a BMW dealership the next day and got the same treatment he'd grown used to everywhere else. Staff glanced at his clothes and decided he wasn't worth their time. A wealthy woman walked in moments later, and every salesperson in the room rushed to serve her instead, ignoring him so completely that even she noticed and made a sarcastic comment about how customers deserved attention, regardless of whether they looked like they could pay. He asked about a car anyway, and got a dismissive answer about specs he hadn't asked for. He left without buying anything, walked across the street, and stepped into a Rolls-Royce showroom instead. He didn't bother explaining his reasoning to anyone, he simply bought one. The next morning, parked well away from school to avoid drawing attention, he scrolled through social media before class and stopped cold on a photo Xu Lingling had posted. His car, his actual Rolls-Royce, captioned as her father's new purchase, like she'd suddenly become his daughter overnight. It turned out she'd spotted it parked near a bus stop that morning, snapped a few photos while the owner wasn't around, and decided to borrow the bragging rights for herself. Classmates crowded around her all morning, amazed that her father had apparently upgraded from a BMW to a Phantom. She soaked in every word of it, casually claiming it was nothing special, just something her dad liked. Xiao Yang sat nearby, saying nothing, unable to decide whether to laugh or feel insulted at suddenly being cast as her father. That amusement didn't last. The school's academic affairs director appeared at the classroom door, asking for him by name, and Xiao Yang was led straight to Li Ani's office, where a man named Xu Jianghua was already waiting with an unfriendly look on his face. Xu Jianghua was Xu Lingling's uncle and the school's director, the man who'd arranged for her admission in the first place, and it didn't take long to understand why he'd come. He accused Li Ani of protecting Xiao Yang unfairly, of spreading rumors about his own niece to cover for a favorite student. Li Ani tried to explain that she hadn't protected anyone, that Xu Lingling really had lost the funds herself, and they could bring in the restaurant owner to confirm it if necessary. Xu Jianghua wasn't interested in facts. He threatened her teacher evaluation instead, the one she'd spent nearly half a year preparing for, warning her that continuing to defend Xiao Yang would cost her that chance entirely. Watching her sit there, absorbing that threat in silence, made something twist painfully in Xiao Yang's chest. Whatever she thought of him, she was still the person who'd raised him, fed him, argued herself hoarse, trying to get him into university when his grades weren't good enough. Seeing her bullied by a man abusing his position was harder to sit through than any insult aimed at himself. Xu Jianghua turned on him next, telling him that being poor didn't earn him anyone's pity, that he was there to study, not play the victim. He lectured them both for a long stretch before finally leaving. and once the office fell quiet, Li Annie rubbed her temples and told Xiao Yang, almost too tired to sound angry anymore, that if his grades were better, none of this would keep happening. He wanted to say something in return, something that might actually reach her. In the end, he stayed quiet and went back to class. That evening, wanting to do something to lift her mood after a day that had clearly worn her down, he picked up food from a restaurant where the manager had come to know him well, planning to surprise her with it at home. On his way out, he ran into Xu Jianghua again, who assumed from his presence there that he was moonlighting as a waiter and threatened to report him to the school for embarrassing them. The insults kept coming, aimed now at Li Annie too, accusing her of being unfit to teach anyone. That was more than Xiao Yang could stomach quietly. He was still holding his tongue when a car pulled up and Zhou Chang stepped out, greeting Xu Jianghua casually before spotting Xiao Yang and going pale on the spot. Whatever confidence Zhou Chang usually carried evaporated instantly. He made a hurried excuse about forgetting an appointment and left without setting foot in the restaurant. Xu Jianghua, completely unaware of what had just happened, exploded with fury the moment Zhou Chang's car disappeared, accusing Xiao Yang of scaring off the school's most important investor. He didn't know yet how right and how wrong he actually was about who held the power in that exchange. Word soon reached the principal's office, and Xu Jianghua marched in the next morning, ready to make an example of someone. He summoned Xiao Yang directly, telling Principal Huang that this troublesome student had personally driven away the school's investor, ruining a partnership worth far more than any single family could replace. He painted himself as blameless throughout, insisting he'd tried to warn everyone about Xiao Yang's character from the start, and made sure to drag Li Annie into it too, calling her failure to control her own student proof that she wasn't fit to be trusted with the evaluation she'd worked toward all year. Principal Huang listened without interrupting, and for a moment it looked like the speech might actually work. Then his expression shifted, and he brought his fist down on the desk hard enough to make Xu Jianghua flinch. He asked what kind of teacher tried to shift an entire investment failure onto the shoulders of a student who had barely stepped outside a classroom before. Xu Jianghua tried to protest that Xiao Yang had genuinely offended the investor. Principal Huang cut him off, informing him flatly that there was no longer anything to worry about regarding the investment. Something had clearly already reached the principal that hadn't reached the director yet, and Xiao Yang suspected exactly what, though he said nothing. Xu Jianghua kept scrambling for someone else to blame, first pointing at Li Annie again, then grasping for any excuse that might save him. None of it worked. Principal Huang told him plainly that he'd disappointed him, that a school leader ought to have more dignity than this, and sent him off to reflect on his conduct. He left the office with his head down, the fight completely gone out of him. Xiao Yang returned to class, not entirely sure what he'd just witnessed, but by then, Xu Lingling had already gotten hold of a version of the story that suited her better. She stood in front of the room, announcing that he'd single-handedly wrecked the school's chance at becoming a top-tier institution, that their futures were all in jeopardy because of him. The story spread fast, and by the time Li Annie walked in to start class, half the room believed the school was on the verge of collapse because of one poor student's arrogance. Li Annie shut the rumor down the moment Xu Lingling repeated it to her, snapping that she'd already warned everyone about spreading hearsay before anything was confirmed. Xu Lingling backed down, visibly frustrated that once again, nothing seemed to stick to him, no matter how hard she tried, and privately, she couldn't understand why he seemed completely unbothered by a disaster she was certain would end his time at the school. That evening brought a different kind of ambush. His aunt invited both of them to dinner, and the moment they arrived, her smile toward Li Annie froze into something much colder when she noticed Xiao Yang standing beside her. Cheng Yu was already seated at the table, and it became obvious in seconds that the entire dinner had been arranged to push the two of them together, with Xiao Yang treated as an afterthought nobody had actually invited. Throughout the meal, his aunt kept steering conversation toward Cheng Yu's wealth and generosity, praising his family connections, hinting broadly that he could solve Li Annie's investment troubles with a single phone call. Cheng Yu played the part well, offering to help with recruitment offering to explain financial matters she supposedly didn't understand, each gesture wrapped in just enough charm to look sincere. Every time Xiao Yang tried to interject, his aunt shot him a look sharp enough to cut glass. When Cheng Yu reached across the table to shake Leonie's hand a second time, Xiao Yang beat him to it, grabbing the offered hand first and greeting him with a smile that clearly unsettled the other man more than it should have for something so small. When his aunt tried placing food into Leonie's bowl on Cheng Yu's behalf, Xiao Yang plucked it out with his own chopsticks and ate it himself, earning a glare from Leonie and a flash of irritation from Cheng Yu that he didn't bother hiding well. His aunt eventually lost her patience entirely, pulling him out into the corridor to demand what he thought he was doing, interrupting something so important. He asked her plainly if the whole dinner had just been a setup to get Cheng Yu closer to her niece. She didn't deny it. She told him bluntly that he wasn't worthy of Leonie, that clinging to her would only drag her down, while a man like Cheng Yu could hand her everything she needed without effort. That was the moment he learned what Leonie had actually been struggling with. She was trying to build an educational institution and needed investment funding badly enough that his aunt saw it as the perfect leverage point. Before he could think through what to do with that information, Leonie and Cheng Yu stepped out of the restaurant together, Leonie announcing she had something urgent to attend to and needed to leave. She walked straight past her aunt and told Xiao Yang, almost as an afterthought, to stop standing around and get in the car. He didn't need telling twice. A few nights later, a reservation mix-up gave him the chance to publicly outmaneuver both his aunt and Cheng Yu at once. He'd booked the restaurant's top private table without telling anyone and arrived to find his aunt and Cheng Yu already seated there, having been mistakenly shown to his reservation by a new employee. His aunt spotted him first and immediately assumed he was there, working another part-time job, mocking him loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. When the confusion finally got sorted out and the waiter confirmed the table genuinely belonged to Xiao Yang, his aunt refused to accept it, insisting there had to be some mistake, that someone like him could never afford a table like that. Cheng Yu tried salvaging the moment by demanding an upgrade to a different VIP table, only to be told every one of them was already booked. The scene drew stares from half the restaurant before Xiao Yang finally stepped in and told the staff there was no need to make a fuss. He let them keep the table, put the entire bill on his own account, and dropped a stack of cash down before walking out, leaving both of them sitting there in stunned silence with nothing to say. It was a small victory, but it cost him something too. His aunt's hostility toward him only sharpened after that night, and Leonie, who hadn't even been present to see it, remained just as convinced as ever that he was reckless with money he had no right to be spending. Every quiet win against people who despised him seemed to widen the gap between what he knew about himself and what the person who mattered most still believed. The next morning, Shu Lingling caught him before class and asked if he was coming to that night's class reunion. The last gathering before graduation split them all apart for good. He turned her down flat, without even thinking about it. Something about her sudden friendliness didn't sit right, not after everything she'd put him through. She pushed harder, and so did Zhang Yong, and soon half the class had joined in, accusing him of holding a grudge, of being petty, of refusing to let bygones be bygones. Shu Lingling even offered something close to an apology, admitting the theft accusation had been a misunderstanding. Xiao Yang saw through the performance easily enough, but with the whole room pressing him, refusing any longer would only cause more trouble than it was worth. He agreed to go, against his better judgment. That evening, once everyone had settled into their seats at the private room, Shu Lingling stood up with a proud announcement. Her cousin had just returned from overseas, and moments later, a well-dressed young man walked through the door. Several classmates recognized him immediately as Wu Ha, heir to the Wu family's real estate business, and the room lit up with excitement none of them had shown for Xiao Yang in years. Wu Ha played the generous host well at first, offering to cover the whole night's bill, basking in the admiration pouring in from every direction. When he noticed Xiao Yang sitting quietly off to the side, Shu Lingling had already filled him in on the supposed troublemaker who'd bullied her, and Wu Ha approached with a glass of wine, needling him to drink. Xiao Yang declined, explaining honestly that he'd driven himself and needed to stay sober enough to get home. Zhang Yong jumped in immediately, accusing him of disrespecting Wu Ha's generosity, and the mood in the room cooled fast. Wu Ha set his glass down hard and returned to his seat without another word, clearly offended that anyone would refuse him something so simple. Dinner continued under a noticeably colder atmosphere until Zhang Yong excused himself and didn't come back for a long stretch. When he finally returned, he looked shaken, explaining nervously that he'd run into some men in the hallway, that there'd been pushing and cursing, that things had gotten a little out of hand. He tried to play it off as nothing, insisting the other side had started it. Wu Ha waved off the concern entirely, boasting that the restaurant owner was a personal friend of his, that nobody would dare cause trouble under his watch. Moments later, the door slammed open, and a scarred, heavy-set man stormed in with a group of enforcers behind him, demanding to know which one of them had hit his associate. Zhang Yong, emboldened by Wu Ha's presence, stood up and admitted it loudly, throwing out Wu Ha's name like a shield. It didn't work the way he expected. The man calling himself Brother Long ordered his men to grab him anyway, and when Wu Ha stepped forward trying to flex his family's name, dropping the words Wu Family Real Estate like they carried weight everywhere, Brother Long simply asked how much it would cost to make this go away. Wu Ha, assuming the damage from a few slaps couldn't run more than tens of thousands of yuan, offered to pay. Brother Long held up 3 fingers. 3 million. The room went silent. Wu Ha's face darkened, not because the sum was impossible for his family, but because he'd recently spent heavily on a new car and didn't have that kind of cash on hand, and because paying it would mean word getting out that he'd been shaken down in public. He called it extortion instead of paying, and Brother Long's men responded by beating Zhang Yong to the floor while he screamed. Wu Ha tried threatening them with his father's name, and Brother Long, having already decided the outcome wouldn't change regardless, ordered his men to drag Wu Ha down as well and beat both of them together. Every classmate in that room froze, too frightened to move. Xiao Yang watched from the corner for a while, and there was a part of him that didn't mind seeing Zhang Yong get exactly what his arrogance had been begging for. But the beating kept escalating past anything reasonable, and no matter what history existed between them, Zhang Yong was still someone he'd sat next to in class for years. Eventually, he stepped forward, walked past the stunned onlookers, and leaned close to Brother Long's ear, offering to settle the 3 million himself, quietly, outside. Brother Long studied him for a long moment before following him into the corridor, visibly confused by how easily this ordinary-looking student had agreed to a number that had made a real heir hesitate. Xiao Yang handed over an account number without ceremony, and less than a minute later, the transfer went through. Brother Long stared at the notification on his phone like he didn't quite trust it. When Xiao Yang casually asked if the amount had been too little, Brother Long's expression shifted from disbelief to something closer to respect. Xiao Yang asked only one thing in return, that the matter stay between them, that he preferred to keep a low profile. Brother Long nodded slowly, turning the request over in his mind. A man who could pay 3 million without blinking and didn't even want credit for it wasn't the kind of person you cross twice. He called off his men and led them out, telling Xiao Yang quietly that he could call on him if he ever needed anything. The moment they left, the room erupted with relief and gratitude, classmates rushing to thank him, marveling at connections nobody knew he had. Then, Wu Ha's mood soured. Rather than gratitude, he demanded to know why Xiao Yang hadn't spoken up sooner, accusing him of deliberately letting them suffer for entertainment. Shu Lingling piled on immediately, and soon the room's whole mood had flipped against him, as if paying 3 million yuan to save 2 people who'd spent the night mocking him somehow made him the villain of the story. Xiao Yang didn't bother arguing. He told them plainly that a reunion dinner shouldn't end with him being blamed for everything, and that they shouldn't bother inviting him next time. He walked out without looking back, quietly wishing he'd stayed in his corner and kept his money. Driving home, still holding on to his frustration, he found Liani waiting on the sofa with an expression that made his stomach drop before she'd even said a word. She told him, without looking up, that his aunt wanted them both at dinner the next night. He agreed, too tired to argue, though something about the invitation nagged at him. His aunt had never once wanted his company for anything, and he doubted that had changed overnight. The following evening confirmed his suspicion the second they walked in. His aunt waved brightly at Liani, her smile freezing solid the instant she noticed Xiao Yang beside her. Chung Yu was already seated at the table, and it became obvious this had never been a family dinner at all. Just another attempt to push the two of them together, while treating him as an unwelcome accident. His aunt tried pulling Liani aside to ask why she'd brought him along, as if he were some stray she'd picked up off the street. Liani sat down anyway, directly across from Chung Yu, ignoring the tension entirely. Throughout the meal, Chung Yu worked to steer conversation toward business, mentioning that his company was looking into investments in education, dropping just enough detail to make clear he could solve Liani's funding problem with a single approval. His aunt lit up at the suggestion, praising him as reliable and capable in a way clearly meant as a comparison to the man sitting right beside her. Every time Chung Yu tried to pull Liani into a private conversation about her institution, Xiao Yang interrupted, needling him with questions he had no real interest in the answers to, just enough to derail the moment. His aunt finally snapped and told him to be quiet, and the meal ended with Liani abruptly excusing herself, citing something urgent that had come up, though what had actually come up was her own patience running out. Lying awake that night, Xiao Yang finally understood the full shape of the problem. Liani needed real investment funding for her education startup, and pride would never let her accept it from someone like Chung Yu without strings attached, nor would she ever accept it from him directly if she knew where it came from. She'd made that clear enough already, telling him once not to even dream about using her connections to skip ahead in life. If he wanted to help her, it would have to happen somewhere she'd never think to look. The next morning he called Li Chung-li, the restaurant manager who'd been quietly building a relationship with him ever since learning he wasn't the poor waiter everyone assumed. Li Cheng had been eager for a chance to prove his usefulness, and when Xiao Yang explained he wanted to establish an investment company but couldn't personally appear as its owner, Li Cheng assumed this was some kind of test of his abilities and promised to handle it within days. He delivered faster than expected. 2 days later, he called with an address, a 5-story office building he'd arranged to acquire outright, explaining that speed mattered more than size, and that the existing company, though unremarkable in performance, had a fully functioning operating system ready to run investments the moment ownership changed hands. While Li Chung went to fetch the current owner for the handoff, Xiao Yang wandered the building on his own and nearly got knocked over by a young employee struggling under a stack of folders. He steadied them for her, and she thanked him, explaining apologetically that she wasn't used to help. In the elevator up to the second floor, she mentioned business hadn't been great lately, her tone carefully neutral in the way people speak when they're used to not complaining out loud. The moment the doors opened, a heavy-set manager came storming toward them, berating the young woman, whose name turned out to be Chenu, for taking too long. Then noticing Xiao Yang and demanding to know who'd let some outsider wander the building. When he accused her of risking company secrets over a random stranger, threatening to strip her bonus entirely, Xiao Yang stepped in and told him he was going too far. The manager, whose name was Wang, turned his contempt on Xiao Yang instead, telling him to mind his own business and get out within 10 seconds, or he'd call security. Li Cheng arrived in the middle of the shouting and immediately scolded Wang for speaking to Xiao Yang that way, which only made the man laugh harder, dismissing Li Cheng's authority entirely and telling him this was his territory to run as he pleased. That was when a slap cracked across his face, delivered by a middle-aged man who turned out to be the company's actual owner and Wang's brother-in-law. The owner was furious, disowning him on the spot in front of everyone, then turning to Li Cheng with a flood of apologies, clearly terrified of losing whatever deal was on the table. Li Cheng told him plainly that his opinion mattered less than what Mr. Xiao thought of the whole situation. The owner turned to Xiao Yang, bracing for the deal to collapse. Xiao Yang told him there was no need to look elsewhere, that he hadn't come expecting the company to make him rich anyway, only needing it functional enough to serve its real purpose. Relief washed visibly over the man's face. Xiao Yang wrapped up the conversation quickly, mindful of the time, and turned to leave, telling Li Cheng to handle the rest and asking, almost as an afterthought, what should happen to the manager who'd caused all the trouble. He answered without much thought, telling Li Cheng to deal with it however seemed fair, and to let Chenu help manage things if the workload ever got heavy. It wasn't until he'd already stepped into the elevator that the full weight of what he'd just said landed on the floor behind him. Li Cheng turned to ask which of them was Chenu, and when she finally found her voice to answer, he announced she'd be the company's new general manager, effective immediately. Wang's panic set in fast. He begged his brother-in-law to intervene on his behalf, only to be told there was nothing left to save, that the company wasn't his to protect anymore. He turned to Li Cheng next, groveling shamelessly, and got nothing but a cold reminder that Mr. Xiao had already been generous enough by not holding a grudge. Security escorted him out minutes later, his entire position gone in the space of one conversation he'd started by underestimating a stranger in the hallway. With the company's ownership settled, Xiao Yang drove straight toward the school, aware that time was slipping away from him faster than he'd planned. He still had one more obligation waiting, one Li Ani had already warned him not to miss, under any circumstances. Traffic swallowed the drive whole, and by the time he neared the school, his phone was already buzzing with Li Ani's voice, sharp and impatient, demanding to know where he was and whether he'd forgotten the recruitment fair entirely. He told her he hadn't forgotten, that he was stuck in traffic and would be there soon. It didn't soften her mood at all. She told him he had 15 minutes, and then the call ended before he could say anything else. Meanwhile, on campus, Chung Yu had spotted Li Ani standing alone and used the opportunity to needle her about her investment troubles, offering once again to solve everything with a single phone call and a dinner invitation. She turned him down flat, her patience for him worn thin in a way she made no effort to hide, though she kept glancing at her watch, clearly distracted by something else entirely. Nearby, a group of female students noticed Xiao Yang approaching and made no effort to lower their voices, wondering aloud why someone like him would even bother interrupting a conversation between Li Ani and a man so obviously out of his league. Xiao Yang ignored them, and the moment Li Ani spotted him, she abandoned Chung Yu mid-sentence and walked straight over to scold him for arriving late to both class and the fair. When she asked where his resume was, his stomach dropped. He'd forgotten it entirely. He sprinted off to print copies before she could finish exploding, leaving her standing there fuming, while the group of students dissolved into laughter behind her. Chung Yu, humiliated at being brushed aside so completely for a printing error, muttered under his breath that he'd make sure Xiao Yang paid for ruining his moment, promising himself he wouldn't just block him from getting hired. He'd destroy his reputation while he was at it. When Xiao Yang returned with a fresh stack of resumes, the fair stretched out in front of him, dozens of booths crowded with anxious students clutching folders like life rafts. He felt strangely detached from all of it. Buying a handful of these small companies outright wouldn't have been difficult for him, but showing up empty-handed would only give Li Ani another excuse to lecture him for months, so he pressed on. Zhang Yong found him first, sneering about how relaxed he looked for someone with no real prospects, and a cluster of classmates joined in, joking about how awkward it would be running into him as a waiter years from now. He brushed past them without engaging, letting the comments slide off, like they always did. A familiar voice caught his attention a few booths later, unmistakably Zhou Chang, flirting badly with a nervous applicant who clearly wanted to leave. When Xiao Yang approached, Zhou Chang's easy arrogance dissolved the instant he recognized him, and he practically fled the booth, with his interviewers trailing in confusion behind him. A man in his 30s who'd witnessed the whole retreat introduced himself as an HR manager from a company called Huashang Group, curious what could possibly rattle someone like Zhou Chang that badly. Zhou Chang, still shaken, admitted he didn't know exactly who Xiao Yang was, only that he'd once seen him casually spend close to 10 million yuan without blinking. He guessed, half joking, that the boy might be some wealthy family's illegitimate son, hiding out under a common surname, testing people's characters for fun. The manager, whose name was Huang, turned the idea over with real interest, rather than dismissing it. If there was even a chance it was true, building a relationship with someone that well connected could open doors his company badly wanted opened. He decided quietly to look into it, filing the name away for later. Unaware any of this was happening, Xiao Yang kept moving through the fair until Cheng Yu called out to him, waving him toward his company's booth with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Xiao Yang had no intention of taking a job there, but noticing Li Ani watching from a distance, he decided it was worth the performance and handed over a resume. Cheng Yu pretended to study it for a moment before announcing, loudly enough for the surrounding booths to hear, that he recognized Xiao Yang as the student who'd behaved improperly at school, the one rumored to have stolen money. The accusation spread through the crowd instantly, drawing stares from every direction. Xiao Yang denied it firmly, but Cheng Yu pressed harder, claiming multiple classmates had confirmed it, that surely they knew his character better than anyone. He tossed the resume onto the ground for effect and announced to every booth within earshot that hiring a student like this would only invite trouble. Several recruiters nodded along without question, and for a moment, Xiao Yang felt the old, familiar weight of being judged guilty before anyone bothered asking for proof. He demanded to know who would even testify against him, and Cheng Yu shot back, coldly, that the better question was who would testify for him. Nobody stepped forward, not at first. Then a man pushed through the crowd, bent down and picked the resume off the ground without a word of hesitation. He said simply that he believed him, and something about the calm certainty in his voice cut through the noise instantly. Every eye turned to the badge on his chest, identifying him as Huang, HR manager of Huashang Group. Cheng Yu tried to wave him off, insisting this had nothing to do with him, but Huang pointed out that any student at this fair could end up working for his company, which made it very much his concern. When Cheng Yu sneered that Xiao Yang was a thief, Huang asked flatly what evidence he had beyond gossip, reminding him that branding a student a criminal without proof could destroy years of effort in a single sentence. Cheng Yu shrugged it off, saying that if someone's future could be ruined that easily, maybe they hadn't worked hard enough to begin with. Something in Huang's expression went cold at that. He told Cheng Yu plainly that it was easy to talk about hard work when you'd been born into every advantage imaginable, that people like him owed their comfortable lives to employees struggling far below them, and that a man who couldn't respect an applicant standing in front of him would regret it eventually. Then he raised the resume and reminded him that it represented a person's education, effort, and dignity, and that throwing it on the ground wasn't something he had any right to do. The crowd's mood shifted visibly in Huang's favor. Cheng Yu's face darkened, and he declared that his company would never hire someone like Xiao Yang regardless. Huang glanced at Xiao Yang and said, with the faintest trace of amusement, that he doubted anyone would want to work somewhere run with that kind of attitude anyway. Xiao Yang agreed without hesitation, telling the gathered crowd he wouldn't work for a company that couldn't respect people, even if he were starving. Huang smiled at that and asked if he'd be willing to submit his resume to Huashang Group instead, admitting he couldn't promise anything, but offering an honest chance. Xiao Yang accepted, and the two of them walked off together toward Huang's booth, leaving Cheng Yu standing alone with his humiliation on full display. Nearby, Zhang Yong and the girls who'd been mocking Xiao Yang all afternoon quickly reassured each other that it meant nothing, that his grades would never meet Huashang's standards regardless of who vouched for him. It gave them something to hold on to, even if none of them could explain why a man like Huang had bothered defending him in the first place. Once they'd found a quieter corner, Xiao Yang thanked him sincerely, aware that standing up to Cheng Yu publicly wasn't something a company employee did lightly. Huang brushed it off, but admitted the real reason when pressed. He'd grown up poor himself, bullied by wealthy classmates with nobody willing to intervene on his behalf, and watching the same pattern play out in front of him had been more than he could ignore. Xiao Yang felt genuine respect settle in his chest, the kind that didn't come easily to him anymore after so many months of being underestimated. Huang's expression shifted back to something more businesslike, almost immediately, warning him not to mistake sympathy for a guaranteed job offer, that everything still had to go through the proper process. Xiao Yang understood, and they returned together to the booth, where Huang sent him to wait in line like every other applicant, promising nothing beyond a fair shot. The interview itself was unremarkable. Brief questions, a polite dismissal, nothing to suggest the meeting had mattered at all. What Xiao Yang didn't see was Huang pulling the interviewer aside afterward, quietly instructing him to keep that particular resume safe and place it on a pending list, brushing off the man's confusion about why an ordinary-looking applicant deserved special treatment. Whatever Huang's real motives were, curiosity, calculation, or something closer to genuine belief, he wasn't ready to explain them to anyone yet. He kept moving through the fair for the rest of the afternoon, dutifully applying wherever he could, if only to keep Leonie off his back. When she found him again, she demanded a progress report, and his vague answer of most of them only irritated her further. She reminded him sharply that with his grades, half-hearted effort wouldn't get him anywhere, and ordered him to keep going. Her phone rang moments later, an unfamiliar number that turned out to be someone claiming to represent a company called Dongxin Investment, interested in funding educational startups. Her eyes lit up instantly. She arranged a meeting for that same evening, 8 o'clock, a restaurant she named without hesitation, and the tension that had been sitting on her shoulders for days eased visibly the moment the call ended. Xiao Yang recognized the restaurant's name immediately. It belonged to the same manager who'd been quietly working his connections, and he understood exactly who'd made that call. He said nothing, letting her walk off, believing her problem had solved itself. By the time the fair wound down that evening, he ran into Zhang Yong's group again, Shu Lingling among them this time, still probing for details about how his applications had gone. When he admitted he had no results yet, they turned it into another round of mockery, contrasting his uncertain future with Shu Lingling's guaranteed spot at her cousin's real estate company and Zhang Yong's father-arranged position waiting for him after graduation. Someone mentioned that Huang from Huashang Group had personally intervened on his behalf, and for a second, the group's tone shifted toward something like grudging curiosity, before Zhang Yong dismissed it, insisting it meant nothing. Before Xiao Yang could leave, Shu Lingling stopped him, telling him her cousin wanted to see him. A white Audi pulled up moments later, and Wu Ha stepped out to a chorus of admiration from the girls nearby, comparing his car favorably to everyone else's, except, pointedly, to the Rolls-Royce Shu Lingling still believed belonged to her father. Wu Ha handed Xiao Yang a thin card, an invitation to a banquet the following night, framing it as a thank you for solving their problem at the reunion. Xiao Yang accepted mostly to end the conversation, sensing already that Wu Ha's gratitude wasn't quite what it appeared to be. That night, a message from Li Cheng confirmed everything had gone according to plan, and Xiao Yang made his way to the restaurant early to overhear the negotiation firsthand. Through the thin wall separating the private rooms, he listened as Li Zhonyan nervously proposed an investment of 700,000 yuan, prepared to accept even half that amount if it came to it. Li Cheng shook his head, and her heart audibly sank through the wall until he told her 700,000 was far too little, that they were prepared to offer 2 million instead. She could barely process the number. When she asked cautiously about equity or profit sharing, worried there had to be some catch, Li Cheng assured her the investors wanted nothing beyond the returns already outlined in her own proposal. Relief flooded her voice as she thanked him, offering to meet the company's owner personally to express her gratitude. Li Cheng deflected smoothly, explaining that his boss was young, barely into his 20s, remarkably accomplished, and fiercely private about staying out of the spotlight. Li Scani admitted, almost to herself, that finding someone so young and so humble was rare these days. Then Li Cheng added, almost carelessly, that his boss reminded him a little of Xiao Yang, similar age, similar way about him. She went quiet for a moment at that, though nothing in her voice suggested she'd connected the dots. Xiao Yang sat in the next room smiling to himself, relieved she hadn't figured anything out, and slipped away before she could catch him there. The following afternoon, he went shopping for something to wear to Wu Ha's banquet, only to run into Zhang Yong and Shu Lingling browsing the same store. She mocked him openly for even considering a suit, warning him that no matter what he wore, people would still smell poverty on him. When a salesperson brought over a modest option priced at 4,600 yuan, Zhang Yong sneered that Xiao Yang probably couldn't afford even that. Xiao Yang let him have it, then asked the salesperson almost idly whether they carried anything above 50,000. The question landed like a joke to both of them until the salesperson admitted their most expensive suit ran 12,000, a fraction of what he'd asked about. Xu Lingling recovered quickly, insisting 12,000 wasn't impressive at all, and when Xiao Yang pointed out that was strange coming from someone eyeing a suit less than half that price, her pride wouldn't let the comment go unanswered. She ordered one for herself on the spot, and when it came time to pay, quietly discovered Zhang Yong didn't have enough on his card, forcing her to hand over her own in front of everyone. Once the transaction embarrassed them both sufficiently, she turned back to Xiao Yang, daring him to buy one too, certain he'd back down. He asked why he would bother, since the shop, as it happened, only had a single unit of that suit in stock, a detail he'd noticed, and quietly rearranged the signage around the moment he walked in. Neither of them had checked before rushing to buy it. Watching their faces fall was worth more to him than the suit itself would have been. He bought a different one entirely, from a boutique down the street, something that actually fit him well, and drove to the banquet that evening with a growing sense that something about the night ahead would test him in ways the suit shop hadn't. When he arrived, security stopped him at the door, informing him flatly that his name wasn't on any guest list and no invitation meant no entry. He hadn't thought to bring the card Wu-ha had given him, and calling the man who'd arranged everything got him nowhere, his phone unreachable all evening. Wu-ha appeared minutes later, feigning surprise at the mix-up while barely hiding his satisfaction. He'd never actually handed over a real invitation, only told Xiao Yang the location, banking on exactly this moment to humiliate him in front of a crowd he desperately wanted to impress. Another car pulled up while he stood arguing with the guards, and Liani stepped out in a black evening gown that stopped him mid-sentence for a beat longer than he meant to let show. She spotted him immediately and asked, with open suspicion, why he was even there. He explained that Li Cheng had invited him and simply hadn't arrived yet with the confirmation. Before she could respond, Wu-ha cut in smoothly, claiming he organized the entire event and had never heard of any manager Li. Xu Lingling, who'd trailed in behind them with Zhang Yong, seized the moment, pulling out her phone to show Liani footage from the suit shop earlier that day, framing it as proof he'd been obsessing over rich society ever since. Liani's expression froze into something colder than the evening air. He tried to explain that the video didn't show what she thought it did, but she wasn't listening anymore. She accused him of chasing status out of some kind of desperate vanity, asked how she could possibly be attached to someone so obsessed with appearances, and pulled her own invitation from her bag, shoving it at him before turning and driving off without giving him a chance to catch up. Xu Lingling didn't waste the opportunity, remarking loudly that he'd managed to anger his own teacher into abandoning him entirely. Wu-ha laughed along, telling him plainly that he'd never belonged at an event like this to begin with. That was when a well-dressed older man came hurrying outside, drawn by the commotion. This was Song Yu Cheng, the banquet's host and one of the city's most prominent financiers. He asked what was happening, and Wu-ha quickly explained that some outsider had tried sneaking in and was being removed. Song Yu Cheng barely glanced at him before turning his attention toward the one person still standing there, unclaimed and unexplained. He asked which company Xiao Yang represented. Xiao Yang admitted, somewhat sheepishly, that he'd genuinely forgotten the name of his own shell company in the chaos of the evening, offering only his real name instead. Something shifted instantly in Song Yu Cheng's face, a flicker of recognition that hadn't been there a moment earlier. Before he could say more, Li Cheng finally arrived, his car having broken down along the way, explaining the delay in a rush of apologies. Song Yu Cheng's expression relaxed into something close to relief once introductions were made, and he personally escorted them both inside, promising to investigate exactly how such a mistake had happened at the door. Inside the hall, Wu-ha spotted him again, almost immediately, and demanded, in front of a gathering crowd, to know who'd let him pass security this time. Xiao Yang answered calmly that he'd simply walked in. Wu Ha, insisting he had the authority to remove him as the event's organizer, was met only with amusement, Xiao Yang pointing out that whether Wu Ha himself would still be welcome by the end of the night wasn't as guaranteed as he thought. The room laughed at what they assumed was an empty threat, from someone with no standing to make one. Li Cheng arrived in the middle of the exchange and confirmed, plainly, that he had indeed brought Xiao Yang as his guest, and that whatever status the boy held certainly wasn't Wu Ha's to judge. Wu Ha, rattled but unwilling to back down in front of an audience, warned that pushing further risked offending Song Yu Cheng himself. That was the exact moment Song Yu Cheng reappeared, drawn by the noise again, and Wu Ha rushed to explain that he'd been handling a troublemaker who'd snuck into the party. He pointed directly at Xiao Yang, expecting the host's anger to land where he'd aimed it. Instead, Song Yu Cheng's fury landed on him. He grabbed Wu Ha by the collar and struck him hard across the face in front of the entire room, the sound cutting through every conversation at once. He demanded to know if Wu Ha understood how important this banquet was, reminding him bitterly that he'd only agreed to mentor him as a favor to his father, and that his patience for someone this useless had run out completely. He ordered security to throw him out, announced the cancellation of every business arrangement between the Song and Wu families on the spot, and barred him permanently from any property connected to Song Group. The crowd stood in stunned silence as security dragged Wu Ha away, his protests fading into the hallway. Shu Lingling and Zhang Yang exchanged panicked glances, certain the poor kid they'd humiliated all week was next in line for the same treatment. Instead, Song Yu Cheng turned, walked directly toward Xiao Yang, and bowed. He apologized sincerely for the disruption to his evening, and the entire hall went quiet with confusion, unable to reconcile what they'd just witnessed. Xiao Yang, uncomfortable with the attention piling onto him, watched Li Cheng lean in and whisper a quiet warning that he preferred to avoid this kind of spotlight. Song Yu Cheng caught the hint instantly, grabbed his hand with sudden warmth, and loudly announced to the room that this was a distant relative of his, one carrying serious weight within the family, despite his youth. Just like that, an invented uncle appeared out of nowhere, and the tension in the hall dissolved into polite curiosity instead of suspicion. Shu Lingling and Zhang Yong slipped away without another word, clearly rattled by a turn of events they couldn't begin to explain. A steady stream of guests approached him afterward, eager to make an impression now that his status seemed confirmed by association, and Xiao Yang let Li Cheng field most of it, growing more tired of the attention with every handshake. Song Yu Cheng found a quiet moment to apologize again personally, and when he mentioned the cooperation project Li Cheng had already discussed, Xiao Yang told him honestly he wasn't in the mood for business talk that night. Song Yu Cheng, sensing correctly that pushing further would only sour the relationship, escorted him out himself. Wu Ha sat outside in his car afterward, humiliation curdling into something closer to hatred, convinced entirely that everything wrong with his evening traced back to one stranger who'd shown up without an invitation. By the time Xiao Yang made it home, the apartment sat dark and empty. Liani hadn't returned from wherever she'd gone after storming off, and something about the silence bothered him more than her usual anger would have. He drove back out, guessing correctly that she'd gone to her office, and found her car parked outside the building where her startup operated. He wasn't planning to approach her, only to make sure she got home safely from a distance. Another car pulled up before he could decide anything, and Chung Yu stepped out, catching Liani just as she was leaving the building. He offered to take her to dinner to celebrate her secured investment, and she refused flatly, trying to walk past him toward her car. He blocked her path, needling Xiao Yang's name into the conversation with a pointed jab about restaurant work, clearly enjoying the contrast he assumed existed between them. Xiao Yang stepped out of the shadows before Chung Yu could press further, ignoring him entirely and speaking directly to Liani instead, suggesting they go home together. She shot him a look that could have frozen the parking lot, got into her car, and told him to stop standing around and climb in. He obeyed without argument, leaving Chengyu standing alone, confused by how thoroughly he'd just been outmaneuvered by someone he considered beneath him. The drive home passed in complete silence, colder than anything spoken aloud could have managed. Once inside, she sat down hard on the sofa, and when he offered weakly to make dinner, her temper finally broke loose entirely. She demanded to know why he'd needed to attend that banquet at all, accused him of chasing shortcuts instead of building anything honestly, and told him flatly that his behavior was an embarrassment. He tried again to explain, and she cut him off with a bitter laugh, unwilling to hear another excuse. Then came the words that actually landed, sharper than anything before them. She told him some people managed to run entire investment companies by his age, while he couldn't even avoid getting thrown out of a party. She said there was no comparison between the two, one belonged in the sky and the other underground, and stormed off to her room without waiting for a response. He sat alone on the sofa afterward, turning the irony over in his mind, until it almost made him laugh out loud. The investment company owner she kept holding up as everything he wasn't, patient, humble, generous, admirable in every way she valued, was him. She'd spent the whole night praising a version of himself she refused to believe existed, while tearing apart the version standing in front of her. Somewhere in that gap between the two, he decided, was exactly where he needed to start. He spent the rest of that night thinking through a plan that felt equal parts desperate and obvious. If Liani refused to see any worth in Xiao Yang, then perhaps it was time she got to know the other man she already admired, the anonymous investor she'd never met, in a form she couldn't dismiss on sight. The problem was practical, rather than emotional. His phone was an old model, barely capable of running one messaging app properly, let alone the kind of separate, convincing identity he'd need to pull this off. He drove to a phone store early the next morning, waving off the usual swarm of salespeople pitching discounts and camera specs he had no interest in. He pointed at a display model instead and asked to see it up close. The salesperson lit up immediately, describing it as their newest limited release, discounted from just under 11,000 yuan down to around 8,900, and mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that it supported multiple accounts running side by side on the same device. That single detail sealed it. He agreed to buy it on the spot and stood waiting while the staff prepared it for him. Before the transaction finished, a woman's voice cut through the store, sweet and impatient, urging her companion to hurry because she wanted this exact phone before it sold out. A heavy-set man draped in gold jewelry trailed behind her, clearly used to being ordered around. The salesperson greeted her by name, calling her Miss Wu, and she pointed straight at the phone already being packaged for Xiao Yang, assuming without asking that it had been set aside for her. She snatched it out of the employee's hands before anyone could object, and when the flustered salesperson tried to explain the mix-up, the woman simply told him to grab another one for the other customer instead, unwilling to entertain the idea that she wasn't entitled to it. Xiao Yang let it go without much reaction. It was only a phone, and arguing over it wasn't worth his time. That indifference seemed to catch her attention more than any protest would have. She studied him properly for the first time, noting the new clothes, the ease in his posture, and decided he was worth a second look. She began working her usual angles, adjusting her collar, sending him glances meant to invite conversation, all while her companion stood obliviously nearby. When that failed to draw any response, she sent the man off to buy her a drink, under some flimsy excuse, and the second he was out of sight, she turned the charm up further, asking Xiao Yang to help fix a loose strap on her dress. He kept his attention on the salesperson searching for a replacement phone and told her plainly he didn't have time, mentioning he needed to get home to cook for his wife. Rather than discouraging her, that detail seemed to amuse her. She pressed closer, tried a line about how nothing at home could compare to something new, and pressed a business card into his hand, uninvited. He glanced at it once and dropped it straight into a nearby trash bin without comment. Her expression shifted the instant she realized she'd been dismissed twice in a row. She warned him, in a voice gone suddenly sharp, that crossing a woman like her could prove more dangerous than he realized. Before he could ask what she meant, she burst into tears at exactly the moment her companion returned, with drinks in hand. He panicked immediately, demanding to know who'd upset her, and she pointed toward Xiao Yang between sobs, spinning a story about being harassed. The salesperson, cornered into confirming details, admitted timidly that Xiao Yang had only helped with her dress earlier, careful not to contradict her outright, given the look she shot him. That vague admission was all the woman needed to twist further, claiming through fake tears that Xiao Yang had insulted her boyfriend directly, threatening violence against him. The man's face went red with fury, and he grabbed Xiao Yang by the collar, promising he was tired of living. Xiao Yang braced for the blow that never landed. Someone caught the man's fist from behind and sent him sprawling to the floor instead, and when Xiao Yang looked up, he recognized the broad-shouldered man standing over him as one of Song Yu-cheng's people from the banquet a few nights earlier. The man on the ground scrambled up in a panic, recognizing the newcomer and stammering an apology before he'd even fully processed what was happening. He tried offering a cigarette as a peace gesture, only to be kicked square in the face for his trouble. The enforcer, whose name Xiao Yang remembered as Hu Jin, bowed respectfully and asked if he was all right, then turned back to the trembling man on the floor and demanded to know exactly what had really happened, warning him plainly about the consequences of lying. Cornered, he finally admitted the truth, that his girlfriend had likely started the entire mess herself. His fury shifted instantly from Xiao Yang to her, and when she tried denying it again, insisting she'd only been defending herself, he struck her twice across the face, harder than the excuses she offered could withstand. Hu Zhen leaned toward Xiao Yang afterward and murmured, almost as an aside, that women who played this particular game usually ended up in one of two places, and neither of them was good. Xiao Yang said nothing to that, uneasy but unwilling to intervene further. She'd built the trap herself, and it had simply closed around her instead. Two men arrived shortly after on a phone call from the boyfriend and dragged her out of the store while she screamed for someone to help her. Nobody moved. Hu Zhen turned back to the man still shaking on the floor and told him coldly to apologize, reminding him that Xiao Yang's restraint tonight had nothing to do with fear or favor, only a preference for staying out of the spotlight, and that a single different word from him could have ended very differently. Once the store had emptied out and calm settled back in, the salesperson finally handed over the replacement phone, still visibly shaken by everything that had unfolded in front of the register. Xiao Yang thanked Hu Zhen briefly and told him he had somewhere to be, slipping the device into his pocket and walking out without lingering on what had just happened. Sitting in his car afterward, he turned the phone over once in his hands, thinking less about the scene at the store and more about what came next. Somewhere across the city, Liani was still convinced that the man she lived with had nothing to offer her, while praising a stranger who existed only because he'd invented him. Tonight, for the first time in longer than he could remember, he had the means to close that distance without revealing the truth all at once. He set the phone up in silence once he got home, creating a second account under a name Liani had never heard before, and stared at the blank message screen for a long while before typing anything at all. Whatever he chose to say first would decide how convincingly he could become someone else in her eyes, someone she might actually respect. He had no way of knowing yet how far that decision would carry him, or how much it would cost the fragile thing still holding the two of them together.